Have you ever wondered why something like a safety pin in an ear or a certain pair of sneakers can mean so much more than just, well, a safety pin or a pair of shoes? Today we're going to dive into how everyday things get turned into these really powerful forms of resistance, and how our whole understanding of these subcultures has evolved in some pretty fascinating ways. And this quote right here, from sociologist Dick Hebdige, really gets to the heart of the puzzle. It's all about this constant battle. A group creates something new, something authentic, and then, almost like clockwork, it gets packaged up and sold right back to the mainstream. This is the cycle of rebellion and commodification that really defines the whole story of subculture. So, to really get this cycle, we have to go back to where this whole academic conversation just ignited, 1970s Britain. Which brings us to our first section, the meaning of style. The key figure here, as we mentioned, is Dick Hebdige. In his totally groundbreaking 1979 book, he saw groups like punks and mods as way more than just kids in some weird outfits. He basically treated their styles like a language. He used semiotics, which, is really just the study of signs and symbols, to decode what they were trying to say to the world. Think of it this way. A safety pin is just a piece of metal, right? But put it through an ear in 1977 London, and all of a sudden it's a symbol, a sign that just screams, "I reject your world." Hebdige was the guy who gave us the decoder ring for that language.
And a really key concept for him was this idea of bricolage. Now, it's a French word, but the idea is actually super simple and brilliant. Hebdige said that subcultures act as bricoleurs. So take the mods, for example. They would grab all these ordinary items, a tailored suit, an army parka, a motor scooter, and assemble them into this new symbolic uniform that completely flipped their original, straight meanings on their head. It was a way of talking back to the mainstream using its own stuff.
Okay, so Hebdige's work was absolutely revolutionary. But it wasn't the whole picture, not by a long shot. Other thinkers came along and pretty quickly saw what was missing. So let's see how the theory expanded, from the street to the mainstream.
Hebdige analyzed punks, mods, teddy boys, skinheads. You start to see a pattern here, right? The initial focus of this whole field was just overwhelmingly male, which raises a huge question that another thinker was about to ask. And this is where Angela McRobbie steps into the story. She wrote girls and young women back into this history, arguing they weren't just passively tagging along. In post-punk culture, she found them right at the center of innovation, running market stalls, digging through secondhand shops for vintage clothes, and just imaginatively recreating styles from scratch. They were the true entrepreneurs of style.
So this visualizes that cycle of commodification we started with, a process Hebdige called incorporation. First, a subculture innovates. Then, entrepreneurs come in and package that style for a wider audience. The mainstream consumes it, and finally, the style becomes frozen, and it kind of loses its original subversive power. The biggest difference between then and now? The speed. This cycle has sped up like you wouldn't believe.
All right, so we've added gender into the mix, but the whole conversation was still super focused on white, working-class youth in Britain. The next step in the evolution of this idea meant we had to zoom out, both geographically and just conceptually. Section 3. Beyond the British scene.
For the longest time, the thinking was that subcultures were against the media. They saw it as the enemy that would eventually just co-opt and destroy their scene. But Sarah Thornton, who was studying club and rave cultures, came along and completely flipped this idea on its head. She argued that for these groups, things like magazines, DJs, and radio were actually essential to their identity. The scene and the media weren't enemies at all. They literally grew up together.
And at the very same time, the conversation was crossing the Atlantic. Trisha Rose turned her focus to the rise of hip-hop, and she argued that you could not understand the style without understanding the importance of place, specifically the post-industrial landscape of 1970s New York City.
And look, this quote from Rose just says it all. Hip-hop wasn't just some music and fashion that appeared out of a vacuum. No way. It was a direct, creative response to very real, very harsh conditions. Social services disappearing, no jobs, police brutality, and all the structural inequalities that African American and Hispanic communities were facing. In her words, it was Black urban renewal. And this really matters because it shows that style isn't just about what you look like. It can be a tool for survival and for building a community.
Okay, so the picture's getting way more complete, right? We've brought in gender, the media, race, and place. But there was another fundamental piece of our identity that was about to blow the whole field wide open again.
This brings us to queering subcultural spaces, and believe me, this was a massive shift. Queer theory came in and moved the focus away from social class and more onto performance, gender, and sexuality, asking all these new questions about how identity is built and how it's challenged.
Cynthia Fuchs, for example, took a close look at the queercore and riot grrrl scenes. She argued that bands like Bikini Kill and Tribe 8 were doing a lot more than just playing punk music. They were taking that original anti-establishment spirit of punk and, supercharging it, using their performances to make visible all these identities that were often ignored, even inside so-called rebellious subcultures.
And then you have the really fascinating work of Judith Halberstam on drag kings. Her point about masculinity is so insightful. You know how our culture tends to treat masculinity as the default, the natural thing, while femininity gets framed as something artificial? Well, Halberstam argued that by making masculinity theatrical, drag king performances totally expose the codes and the roles that dominant masculinity depends on to seem so natural.
And this was not a surface-level thing. Halberstam developed these incredibly detailed taxonomies of different performance styles, giving us a whole new vocabulary. So for instance, butch realness tries to create a completely believable everyday masculinity. But then you have something like fag drag, which playfully critiques gay male stereotypes. Each style is a totally different way of asking, what is masculinity anyway? It just shows the incredible depth and the critical power of these performances.
Whew! We have covered a lot of ground, from 1970s Britain all the way to queer theory. So now let's bring it all together and ask the big question. Why does any of this still matter?
So, at the end of the day, the big takeaway is this. Style is anything but trivial. From the bricolage of the punks taking back everyday items, to hip-hop's cultural renewal of city spaces, to the critical performances of drag kings shaking up our ideas about gender, style is a real material and performative force. It's how people create an identity for themselves, build a community, and actually intervene in the world around them. And all this leaves us with one last big question. We've traced this whole conversation across decades. But what about right now? In a world of TikTok aesthetics, infinite online niches, and microtrends that come and go in a week, what does subculture even look like today? What styles are talking back, and what are they trying to tell us? That's something to think about.